hero or naive. The cowboy who trusted a hunted Apache warrior. Jacob Hayes had always been a man of the open plains. From the time he was a boy, he had grown up under the endless sky, where the wind carried both freedom and danger. His father had been a rancher, and his mother had taught him the value of kindness, honesty, and hard work. By the time he reached adulthood, Jacob had inherited a small stretch of land on the edge of the vast prairie. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give him purpose. He had a modest cabin built from timber he had cut himself, a few cattle grazing in the pastures, and a horse named Buck, loyal and strong, who had been his companion for many years. Jacob's days were simple but demanding. From dawn, he rose with the sun, saddled Buck, and rode across the fields checking fences, herding cattle, and making sure that no harm came to his small herd. He was known among the neighboring ranchers as a man of honesty and courage. If someone needed help, Jacob was always the first to offer it, whether it was fixing a broken fence or defending a ranch from wild animals or rustlers. Yet, despite his helpful nature, Jacob was also careful. Life on the frontier was not kind to the naive or the careless. The prairie could be beautiful, with its rolling hills and golden grass waving in the wind, but it could also be harsh and unforgiving. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jacob rode home from a distant ranch where he had helped a neighbor mend a fence. The air was crisp, and the smell of wild sage carried across the fields. It was quiet, too quiet, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Jacob's instincts, sharpened over years of living in the wild, told him to stay alert. He noticed small signs that something unusual had happened nearby. The grass along a narrow trail was flattened as if someone, or something, had passed through in a hurry. A few branches were broken, hanging loosely, and he could see traces of footprints in the soft earth. Curiosity mixed with caution as Jacob followed the trail, leading him toward a small creek. Smoke rose faintly in the distance, curling toward the sky in thin, lazy streams. He slowed Buck to a walk and scanned the surrounding area. The prairie was quiet, almost too quiet. The wind had shifted, carrying a scent that he couldn't quite identify. It was the smell of fear, sweat, and blood, mingled together in a way that made Jacob tighten his grip on the reins. As he approached the creek, he saw a figure slumped on the ground. The man appeared young but worn, his clothes torn and dirty, and his skin marked with bruises and cuts. Jacob dismounted slowly, keeping his distance until he could get a better look. He had seen injured travelers before, but there was something different about this man. He was alert, with sharp, calculating eyes that seemed to study Jacob just as much as Jacob was studying him. Jacob called out softly, "Hey there, you need some help." The man's head lifted slightly, and he gave a short nod. His voice, when he spoke, was low but steady. "Water, please." Jacob approached carefully, taking out his canteen and handing it to the man. The man drank thirstily, his hands shaking from exhaustion and injury. Jacob noticed the man's clothes and features. He looked different from most settlers or cowboys he had met. There was a hardness in his face, a sense of someone who had spent his life surviving, always on guard. Jacob realized that this man was not just hurt, he was hunted. Despite the warning bells in his mind, Jacob felt a surge of compassion. He remembered the lessons his mother had taught him, to help those in need, even when it was risky. He moved closer, carefully checking the man's injuries. There were cuts along his arms and legs and a deep gash on his shoulder. Jacob used strips of cloth torn from his own shirt to make bandages, cleaning the wounds as best as he could with water from the creek. "My name's Jacob," he said quietly. "You're safe here. Don't worry." The man looked at him with cautious eyes, then nodded. "Anita," he said. It was a name Jacob had never heard before, and it carried a weight that made him pause. There was something proud in the way the man spoke, yet his eyes betrayed years of fear and suspicion. As night approached, Jacob helped Tayanita to his cabin, which was not far from the creek. It was small and simple but warm, with a fireplace that still held some embers from the morning. Jacob offered what little food he had, some bread, salted meat, and a cup of fresh water. Tayanita ate slowly, his gaze flickering around the cabin as though assessing every corner for potential danger. Jacob didn't speak much. He knew that trust couldn't be forced. The man needed time, and he needed to know that Jacob's intentions were genuine. By the fire, Jacob and Tayanita sat in silence for a while. The crackle of flames was the only sound, punctuated by the occasional call of a distant coyote. Jacob noticed that despite the injuries, Tayanita's hands were steady, his movements careful and precise. It was clear he had been trained in survival in a way that Jacob could respect. Yet he also saw the fear in the man's eyes, the fear of being caught, of being judged unfairly, of being hunted for something he may or may not have done. Jacob finally spoke, gently. "You don't have to tell me everything tonight. Just know that you're safe here for now." Tayanita nodded again, and for the first time, Jacob thought he saw a flicker of relief in the man's eyes. There was still caution, but also a tiny spark of hope, the kind that could grow if trust was given and respected. As the night deepened, Jacob reflected on the choice he had made. Helping a hunted man could be dangerous. Word could spread, and soldiers or bounty hunters could come looking for him, but Jacob couldn't bring himself to ignore a person in need. The frontier was harsh, yes, but it was also a place where acts of kindness, however small, could make a lasting difference. Jacob spent the night keeping watch outside the cabin, listening to the sounds of the prairie. Every rustle of grass, every distant howl made him tense, but he never regretted his decision. He believed in fairness and justice, even when the world seemed to reward cruelty. He understood that trust was a gamble. Sometimes it brought betrayal, but sometimes it forged bonds stronger than fear. As the first light of dawn touched the prairie, Jacob looked over at Tayanita, sleeping on a simple bed of blankets. He wondered about the journey that had brought this man here and what challenges lay ahead. One thing was certain: the path forward would not be easy. Danger was never far on the frontier, and helping Tayanita could change Jacob's life forever. Yet Jacob felt ready. With Buck by his side and the quiet determination that had guided him through countless trials, he was prepared to face whatever came next. The plains could be unforgiving, but courage, compassion, and careful judgment could make the difference between survival and disaster. And for Jacob Hayes, the choice to trust a hunted man was not just an act of kindness. It was a test of his own character, one that would define him in the days to come. The sun rose higher, illuminating the golden grass that stretched endlessly across the horizon. Jacob mounted Buck, and with a final glance at Tayanita, he knew that their story had only just begun. What lay ahead was uncertain, but he was determined to face it with an open heart, a clear mind, and the quiet bravery that had always guided him through the wild, unpredictable life of the prairie. The next morning, the sun had barely risen, painting the prairie in soft shades of gold and pink. Jacob Hayes had already been up for some time, checking the fences and making sure his cattle were safe. Yet his thoughts kept returning to the man he had rescued the previous evening. Tayanita was still asleep, wrapped in a blanket Jacob had provided, his breathing steady but cautious. There was something about the way he had carried himself, calm, yet tense, that told Jacob this was a man who had lived a hard life, one filled with constant danger and little trust. Jacob didn't rush him. He understood that trust could not be demanded. It had to grow slowly, like a seed watered carefully until it blossomed. He left Tayanita resting and went about his chores, but every so often he would glance back toward the cabin, thinking about the story that had brought this man to his doorstep. There was a mystery in Tayanita's eyes, a history Jacob could only imagine. He wondered how a man so strong and capable could end up in such a desperate state, fleeing through the prairie with hunters tracking his every move. By mid-morning, Tayanita finally stirred. Jacob had prepared a simple breakfast of bread, dried meat, and coffee brewed over the fire. When Tayanita joined him, his movements were careful but deliberate, as though every step was measured to avoid making a mistake. He thanked Jacob quietly, not with words alone but with a slight nod, a gesture of respect that Jacob appreciated more than anything. "You don't have to tell me everything," Jacob said gently, "just enough so I know how to help you." Tayanita studied him for a long moment. His dark eyes seemed to weigh Jacob's words carefully. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and steady. "I am being hunted," he said simply. "Not for what I have done, but for what others say I have done. I did not harm anyone, yet they call me guilty. Soldiers, settlers, even some who were once my friends, they all want to find me. Some want my life. Others, justice, they call it. But justice is not always truth." Jacob listened, understanding the gravity of the situation. On the frontier, rumors could spread faster than the wind, and false accusations often carried deadly consequences. Helping Tayanita meant more than just bandaging wounds. It meant offering protection, guidance, and perhaps even risking his own safety. Yet Jacob felt a strange sense of duty. It was not just the right thing to do, it was a test of his own values, of the principles that had guided him all his life. For the rest of the day, Jacob helped Tayanita regain some strength. They walked slowly along the creek, letting the water soothe Tayanita's aching muscles. Jacob taught him how to gather edible plants and showed him the safest paths to travel through the prairie without attracting attention. Tayanita, despite his exhaustion, absorbed every word. He asked questions, not out of doubt, but out of a desire to survive. Jacob realized that the man's mind was as sharp as his body, always calculating, always planning. As the sun climbed higher, the two men began to talk more about their lives, carefully navigating the line between sharing and protecting. Jacob spoke of his childhood on the ranch, of the lessons his parents had taught him, and of the quiet life he had built in the prairie. Tayanita, in turn, shared fragments of his past, stories of his family, his village, and the life he had been forced to leave behind. He spoke of traditions, of survival, and of a deep connection to the land. Though the details were scarce, Jacob could sense the weight of every word. This was a man shaped by hardship, whose trust had been betrayed too many times to count. Despite the tension that lingered in the air, there was a subtle bond forming between them. Jacob saw in Tayanita not just a hunted man, but someone with honor, courage, and intelligence. And Tayanita, though wary, began to recognize that Jacob's intentions were genuine. There was no hidden threat, no deception, just a man willing to offer help when most would have turned away. By afternoon, the prairie heat had grown intense, and the men returned to the cabin for shade and rest. Tayanita's injuries were improving, and he moved with greater ease. Yet Jacob could see that the real danger was not the physical wounds. It was the hunters, the people who believed they had a right to take Tayanita's life without proof or mercy. Jacob knew that to protect the man, they would need more than compassion. They would need strategy, awareness, and careful planning. That evening, as they prepared a simple meal, Tayanita finally spoke more openly about his pursuers. "They will not stop until they find me," he said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet tension. "Soldiers follow the law, but law does not always see truth. Settlers follow greed. Both will think nothing of taking my life. You must understand this, Jacob. Helping me is dangerous." Jacob nodded, understanding the risk but not willing to back down. "I know," he said. "I won't turn my back on you, but we'll be careful. We'll watch the land, learn the paths, and stay one step ahead. You don't have to face this alone." Tayanita's eyes softened for a brief moment, a flicker of trust breaking through the years of suspicion. It was rare, Jacob realized, for this man to let anyone see his vulnerability. That brief moment of connection strengthened Jacob's resolve. He knew that the coming days would test both of them, not just physically, but morally. Trusting a hunted man could be naive, but refusing to help would betray every principle Jacob had lived by. As night fell, the prairie took on its familiar hush. The wind rustled the grass, and distant animals moved quietly under the moonlight. Jacob kept watch outside as he had the previous night, while Anita slept inside. He thought about the choices that had brought them together, about the fragile line between heroism and recklessness. Every sound in the night could signal danger, yet Jacob felt a deep sense of purpose. He had chosen to help, and that choice, he realized, was as much about defining himself as it was about protecting another. During the quiet hours, Jacob reflected on the lessons of the land and the people who lived there. Life on the frontier demanded courage, wisdom, and compassion. To survive, one had to understand not just the dangers of the world, but the complexities of human character. And in Anita, Jacob saw a man shaped by those very complexities, someone whose life had been misunderstood, judged unfairly, yet who still carried the strength to endure. By dawn, Jacob and Anita had formed a silent understanding. The road ahead would be dangerous, filled with hunters, suspicion, and uncertainty. But they would face it together, relying on trust, courage, and careful planning. Jacob knew that mistakes could be fatal, but he also understood that refusing to act out of fear would be a greater failure of character. That morning, as the sun rose and the prairie came alive with the sounds of birds and rustling grass, Jacob prepared Buck for a ride. He motioned for Anita to join him. "We'll take a short ride today," he said. "Learn the trails, know the land, and see where we might be safest." Anita nodded, swinging onto a second horse that Jacob had brought around. The two men rode slowly, observing the prairie, noting hiding spots, water sources, and routes that would allow them to move without being easily seen. Every hill, creek, and cluster of trees became part of their strategy. They moved with purpose, yet carefully, aware that each step could reveal them to the eyes of those who sought to harm Anita. As the day wore on, Jacob saw Anita's strength returning. The warrior's movements were confident, deliberate, and full of a quiet power that reminded Jacob of the resilience humans carry when survival is the only option. By mid-afternoon, they paused near a shaded grove, resting their horses and sharing water. Anita spoke little, but his glances toward Jacob conveyed respect and a growing trust. Jacob realized that this partnership, though fragile, had the potential to carry them both through the trials ahead. Evening approached, and the men returned to the cabin. Anita prepared for another night of rest, while Jacob secured the property, reinforcing fences and checking the surroundings. As darkness fell, Jacob reflected on the lessons of the day. He had seen courage, determination, and the quiet strength that comes from enduring hardship. But he had also seen fear, mistrust, and the harsh reality of a world that judged too quickly. Helping Anita was more than an act of kindness. It was a commitment to stand against fear, to uphold justice in a small way, and to prove that trust, even in uncertain times, could be a force for survival. As Jacob lay down that night, listening to the wind and the distant calls of animals, he knew that the bond forming between him and Anita was both a blessing and a responsibility. The days ahead would demand every ounce of courage, wisdom, and patience they could muster. But for Jacob Hayes, the choice was clear: to help a man in need, to trust where others might fear, and to walk the difficult path of honor, even when the world seemed determined to punish it. The prairie slept, quiet and endless, as two men, bound by circumstance and a fragile trust, prepared to face the challenges of a world where survival was never guaranteed, and where courage often came at a price. The days following Anita's arrival passed with cautious routines, yet the prairie felt less lonely to Jacob Hayes. He had grown accustomed to solitude over the years, finding comfort in the wide open spaces and the quiet rhythm of ranch life. But with Tay and Nita, the quiet was no longer empty, it was shared. There was a subtle energy in the cabin, a sense that their lives had intertwined, however reluctantly at first. Jacob noticed the way Tay and Nita observed the land with careful precision, noting tracks in the dirt, listening to the whispers of the wind, and watching the flight patterns of birds. It was clear the man had a survival instinct unlike any Jacob had seen before. Jacob began to teach Tay and Nita the ways of the cattle trails, sharing knowledge he had gathered over years on the prairie. He showed him how to read the grass for signs of rustlers, how to detect the faint footprints of animals or humans, and how to move quietly through the open fields. At first, Tay and Nita absorbed every lesson silently, responding with brief nods and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Gradually, however, he began to offer advice of his own, pointing out subtle signs Jacob had overlooked. A bent blade of grass here, a broken twig there, small details that spoke volumes to someone who had lived constantly under threat. Jacob realized that while he had knowledge of the land, Tay and Nita had knowledge of danger, of how people hunted and were hunted, and the instincts that kept a man alive when everyone else had turned against him. Their partnership grew slowly, shaped by necessity. Each morning they worked together on the ranch, tending to the cattle and repairing fences, but their conversations often drifted to survival, strategy, and the dangers that lay beyond the edges of the prairie. Tay and Nita shared more about the men pursuing him, carefully describing the soldiers, settlers, and bounty hunters without giving away too much. Jacob listened, weighing each word and learning to anticipate threats he had never considered. He understood that protecting Tay and Nita was more than sheltering him in the cabin. It meant teaching him how to navigate the land safely and anticipating the movements of those who would do him harm. Despite the gravity of their situation, there were moments of calm that Jacob cherished. They would ride their horses along quiet trails at dawn, the wind carrying the scent of wildflowers and fresh grass. They would sit by the creek, letting the water wash over tired feet, sharing silent moments that spoke of understanding and mutual respect. Tay and Nita rarely smiled, but Jacob noticed the subtle shifts in expression, small signs of comfort, a quiet acceptance that perhaps not all humans were enemies. These moments reminded Jacob of why he had chosen to help the man in the first place. Trust might have been a gamble, but the potential reward, a genuine bond forged under the most difficult circumstances, was worth the risk. However, the threat of discovery never truly left them. Jacob knew that each day Tay and Nita remained on the prairie increased the danger to both of them. Soldiers and bounty hunters moved in predictable patterns, and word of a wounded man traveling alone could spread quickly. Jacob began to teach Tay and Nita methods of camouflage and misdirection. They experimented with different routes to avoid the main roads, practiced signaling silently to each other, and identified safe spots for rest along their paths. Tay and Nita, in turn, taught Jacob lessons in patience and observation, showing him how to blend with the environment, how to remain unseen even when movement was necessary, and how to trust intuition above all else. One afternoon, while checking a distant pasture, Jacob noticed signs that someone might be approaching. Broken branches, disturbed earth, and faint footprints suggested human presence. He motioned for Tay and Nita to follow quietly, and together they moved to higher ground where they could observe without being seen. From their vantage point, Jacob spotted a small group of men moving slowly through the prairie, scanning the land as though searching for something or someone. Tay and Nita's eyes narrowed. "They are hunters," he whispered. "Soldiers or bounty men, we must avoid them." Jacob's heart pounded, but he kept his voice calm. "Then we move slowly and we stay hidden. Don't make any sudden moves." Together, they maneuvered carefully, using the natural cover of bushes and hills to remain unseen. Jacob followed Tayanita's lead, amazed at the man's ability to anticipate the hunter's movements. Every step was deliberate, every pause calculated until they were safely out of sight. When the danger had passed, Jacob let out a slow breath. "You saved us both," he said quietly. Tayanita only nodded. "Experience," he replied, "and trust. You have trust, Jacob, that is rare." Jacob realized then that trust was indeed the foundation of their survival. It had been his decision to help Tayanita that brought them together, but it was the careful cultivation of trust that kept them alive. Each act of kindness, each moment of patience, reinforced their connection and gave them the strength to face the dangers ahead. Over the next several days, they continued their routines, blending the ordinary work of ranch life with the extraordinary vigilance required to evade those hunting Tayanita. Jacob noticed that their bond deepened not just through shared experience, but through shared respect. Tayanita spoke of his homeland, the customs and traditions that had shaped him, and Jacob shared stories of his own family and the simple joys of prairie life. These conversations, though often brief, were rich with meaning, helping each man understand the other's perspective and building a foundation of empathy that neither had expected. Jacob also began to notice small acts of loyalty from Tayanita, subtle, quiet actions that demonstrated the warrior's growing trust. Tayanita would take the lead in scouting the land, silently guiding Jacob through safer paths. He would alert Jacob to dangers Jacob might have overlooked and offer advice on how to handle encounters with others without attracting attention. Each gesture, though understated, reinforced Jacob's belief that trust, once earned, could be a powerful force, even in a world where betrayal was common. Despite the increasing strength of their bond, Jacob could not ignore the reality of the situation. They were still at risk, and the hunters were relentless. He began to plan for the possibility of confrontation, thinking through contingencies and escape routes. Tayanita, though wary, joined him in these preparations, demonstrating not only his knowledge of survival but also his willingness to cooperate. Together, they mapped the terrain, identified safe zones, and discussed strategies for evading detection. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the prairie was bathed in golden light, Jacob and Tayanita sat by the fire outside the cabin. The air was warm, carrying the scent of dry grass and earth. Tayanita spoke softly, almost to himself. "You could have left me," he said. "Many would have, but you stayed. That is why we are alive." Jacob looked at him, feeling the weight of those words. "I didn't leave because it was right to stay," he said. "Sometimes doing what is right is dangerous. Sometimes it is scary. But I believe it matters more than fear." Tayanita nodded, a faint smile breaking the usual seriousness of his face. "Then perhaps we are both lucky. I have your trust and you have mine. That is not common in this world." The conversation marked a turning point. Jacob realized that helping Tayanita was no longer just an act of kindness. It had become a partnership. They depended on each other for survival, yes, but also for understanding, for companionship, and for a shared sense of purpose. The lines between heroism and naivety blurred. Jacob knew that trusting a hunted man could be risky, but he also understood that the bond they had formed was a strength he could not ignore. As night fell, the prairie came alive with subtle sounds, the rustle of grass, the distant call of animals, and the gentle whisper of the wind. Jacob kept watch, as he always did, while Tayanita rested. Each night reinforced the reality of the dangers surrounding them, but also the resilience of the trust they had built. Jacob thought about the lessons he had learned in just a few short days. Courage was important, yes, but trust and empathy could be even more powerful. A man alone could survive, but two men, working together with respect and understanding, had a chance not only to survive but to thrive. By the time the moon rose high over the prairie, casting silvery light across the rolling hills, Jacob felt a sense of calm determination. The path ahead would be fraught with danger, and the hunters would not give up easily. But with Tay and Anita at his side, he knew they could face whatever came. Trust had been the first step, but it was loyalty, strategy, and mutual respect that would carry them forward. Together, they were no longer just a cowboy and a hunted warrior. They were partners, bound by circumstance and by the careful cultivation of faith in one another. The prairie stretched endlessly around them, beautiful, dangerous, and unpredictable. And as Jacob closed his eyes for a brief rest, he knew that the journey ahead would test every ounce of their courage. Yet in the quiet strength of their partnership, there was hope, a reminder that even in a world filled with fear, danger, and misunderstanding, trust could create bonds strong enough to endure anything. The prairie had never seemed more alive or more dangerous. Jacob Hayes and Tay Anita moved with caution now, fully aware that every sound, every shadow could carry a threat. Their days had settled into a rhythm of careful travel, scouting the land and learning each other's strengths. Jacob had grown confident in Tay Anita's judgment, and Tay Anita, in turn, had begun to trust Jacob's courage and compassion. But both knew that trust could be tested at any moment, and that a single mistake could be fatal. One morning, as the first light of dawn filtered through the tall grass, Jacob noticed something unusual. There were fresh tracks in the dirt, larger and heavier than those of their horses, moving parallel to their route. Jacob motioned for Tay Anita to stop, lowering his hand slowly to avoid alerting whatever might be nearby. They crouched behind a small rise, watching the path below. "They are close," Tay Anita whispered, his eyes scanning every detail. "Hunters, not many but skilled. They will not give up easily." Jacob's heart beat faster, but he remained calm. "Then we wait," he said. "We observe, and we move only when we must." The two men spent the next several hours studying the hunters from their hidden vantage point. They noted their patterns, their pauses, the way they moved through the grass, and the signals they used with each other. Jacob realized that Tay Anita's instincts were remarkable. The warrior could sense danger in ways Jacob never had, predicting the hunter's moves before they even made them. Every glance, every subtle shift in posture, told a story that Jacob had learned to read. By late afternoon, the hunters had moved on, but the threat lingered in the air like a low, persistent hum. Jacob and Tay Anita knew they could not remain in one place for long. They packed their minimal supplies, saddled the horses, and began moving through a series of hills and valleys that offered better cover. Tay Anita led the way, pointing out natural hiding spots, escape routes, and places where they could rest without being easily seen. Jacob followed, marveling at the man's knowledge of the land and the clever ways he used it to stay ahead of danger. As they traveled, Tay Anita shared more about his pursuers. "Some believe they are serving justice," he said quietly. "Others are motivated by greed or by fear of what they do not understand. They do not see the truth, only the story told by others. That story paints me as a criminal, a threat, when all I have done is survive." Jacob listened intently. "Then we must make our own story," he said. "We survive, and we show that trust and courage matter more than fear or rumor." Tay Anita nodded, though his eyes remained wary. Survival had taught him to trust little, but something about Jacob's unwavering sense of honor reassured him. For the first time in a long while, he felt that he could rely on someone other than himself, a rare and fragile feeling. The following days were filled with a mixture of work and vigilance. Jacob continued his routines on the ranch, repairing fences and tending to the cattle, but he was constantly aware of the lurking danger. Tay Anita accompanied him on the rides, scouting ahead and keeping watch for any signs of hunters or other threats. They moved carefully, using knowledge of the terrain to their advantage, hiding in gullies, behind hills, and in patches of dense brush whenever they suspected they might be seen. One evening, as the sun sank low and shadows stretched long across the prairie, Jacob noticed a small group approaching from the distance. They were armed, moving quietly but deliberately, and Jacob immediately recognized the danger. "Hunters," he said, tension tightening his chest. "They've found us." Tayanita's eyes narrowed. "We have little time, we must act carefully." Jacob and Tayanita quickly assessed the situation. The hunters were too close to confront directly, and fleeing blindly would only draw attention. Instead, they chose a clever path that wound through the hills, using every natural feature as cover. Tayanita led Jacob through narrow trails, across streams and over rocky ridges, all while remaining silent and alert. Their coordination was seamless. Every glance and gesture communicated plans without words, a silent language born of necessity and trust. As night fell, the hunters finally lost sight of them, but Jacob knew the danger was far from over. "They will not stop," he said. "We must be prepared for what comes next." Tayanita agreed. "They seek me, yes, but they will test you as well. They will look for weaknesses, for anything they can exploit. We must stay alert and united." The next few days were a test of patience and endurance. Jacob and Tayanita traveled mostly by night, resting during the day in hidden locations carefully chosen to avoid detection. They rationed food and water, moving with deliberate slowness, and constantly scanned the horizon for movement. Every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of grass, the distant call of an animal, was scrutinized. The constant tension could have worn down a lesser pair, but Jacob and Tayanita found strength in their growing partnership. One afternoon, they paused near a small grove to rest and eat. Tayanita spoke quietly, his voice thoughtful. "Jacob, you have risked much to help me. You could have chosen safety, yet you chose to stand by me. That is courage." Jacob shook his head. "It's not just courage, it's trust. You've shown me your strength and wisdom. We rely on each other, and that is why we survive. Neither of us could face this alone." Tayanita looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Perhaps that is what I have been missing. Companionship, trust, someone who does not judge yet understands." That night, as they lay under the stars, Jacob reflected on the path they had taken. The danger they faced was real, yet he felt a sense of purpose stronger than fear. He had chosen to help Tayanita, and that choice had brought a bond neither had expected. Trust, once given, had become their most valuable tool, guiding every decision and keeping them alive. The following morning brought new challenges. Scouts from the hunters had returned to the prairie, and Jacob and Tayanita had to move quickly to avoid being seen. They navigated through hidden trails and dense thickets, using every lesson learned in the previous days. Their cooperation was flawless, a mixture of instinct, careful observation, and mutual respect. By late afternoon, they reached a secluded area near a stream, a place Tayanita identified as relatively safe. "We can rest here," he said. "They will not find us easily. For now, we have a chance to recover." Jacob dismounted, tending to buck while Tayanita checked the surroundings. The two men shared a quiet meal, the tension momentarily eased but never forgotten. They knew the hunters would not give up, and the next encounter could come at any time. Yet there was a strange comfort in this pause, a reminder that survival depended not only on vigilance, but on the trust they had built together. That night, as they sat by a small fire, Jacob spoke quietly. "We have faced danger before, but the real test is ahead. They will return, and we must be ready, but I believe that together we can overcome it." Tayanita nodded, his gaze steady and unwavering. "I trust you, Jacob." "That is rare. You have proven that trust is not weakness but strength. If we stand together, we have a chance." The prairie around them was silent, the stars bright above, as the two men prepared for the trials that lay ahead. The next encounter would test everything, their courage, their judgment, and the trust that bound them. But for Jacob and Tayanita, there was no turning back. They had chosen each other as partners, and that choice, forged in danger and compassion, would guide them through the storm to come. Through every hour of vigilance, every careful maneuver, and every quiet conversation, Jacob understood the truth of their situation. Survival depended not only on skill and knowledge, but on the bonds forged in trust. And in Tayanita, he had found a companion, a teacher, and a friend, someone whose strength and wisdom matched his own courage and resolve. Together, they were ready to face whatever challenges the prairie had yet to bring, knowing that their greatest weapon was the trust they had chosen to give each other. The sun rose slowly over the prairie, painting the endless grasslands in shades of gold and amber. Jacob Hayes and Tayanita were already awake, their senses alert despite the long nights of tension and travel. The previous days had tested them in every way, physically, mentally, and emotionally. But now, the culmination of all their careful planning, trust, and courage was approaching. They knew the hunters would not give up, and sooner or later, confrontation was inevitable. Jacob looked at Tayanita, who was adjusting his horse and checking the small supplies they had carried all this way. "Today may be the day," Jacob said quietly. "We must stay calm, work together, and remember everything we've learned." Tayanita nodded, his eyes steady. "I am ready. The prairie has taught me many lessons. Danger is constant, but so is survival. Today, we survive together." They began moving through a series of hills and ridges that offered both cover and a vantage point. Every step was deliberate. Jacob followed Tayanita closely, noting how the warrior's instincts guided each decision. A broken branch, a patch of trampled grass, even the movement of distant birds, all were signs Tayanita read with precision. Jacob trusted him completely, and in turn, Tayanita relied on Jacob's courage and calm judgment. The bond they had built over the past days was now a weapon as vital as their knowledge of the land. As midday approached, they spotted the hunters ahead. A small group moved carefully across an open plain, scanning the horizon as though expecting to find someone or something. Jacob's chest tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "We know they are here. We have time to plan. We stay hidden, watch their movements, and act only when necessary," Tayanita agreed. "They underestimate us because they think they are following justice. They do not see strategy, nor do they see trust. We will use both." Jacob and Tayanita moved to higher ground, where the hills offered a natural vantage point. From there, they observed the hunters, noting their patterns and anticipating their next moves. Every detail mattered: the direction of their gaze, the spacing between them, the signals they exchanged. Tayanita whispered suggestions, and Jacob followed them without hesitation. They were a team now, synchronized in ways that only extreme necessity could forge. Hours passed as they waited, tension building with every moment. Finally, one of the hunters began to move closer to their position, slightly off from the rest of the group. Jacob and Tayanita exchanged a glance. This was the opportunity they had been waiting for, a chance to create a diversion, to ensure their safety, and perhaps even turn the tables. With careful precision, Tayanita led Jacob through a hidden path along a ridge, moving silently behind bushes and rocks that hid them from view. Every step was deliberate, every pause calculated. Jacob marveled at Tayanita's ability to anticipate danger, to plan escape routes and traps in real time. They reached a small hollow where they could observe the hunters without being seen, and Tayanita motioned for Jacob to stay low. "They are predictable," Tayanita whispered. "We will use that to our advantage." Together, they executed a series of maneuvers that misled the hunters, creating false trails and distractions. They used natural cover, moving in ways that concealed their presence while signaling each other silently. The hunters followed the false trails, unaware that Jacob and Tayanita were always one step ahead. By late afternoon, the hunters began to realize that something was amiss. Confusion spread through the group, and frustration became evident. Jacob and Anita watched quietly from their hidden position, their patience and strategy paying off. It was a test not only of skill but of trust. Their survival depended on their ability to act together, without hesitation or doubt. Finally, as the hunters moved further away, Jacob and Anita seized the moment to retreat safely. They navigated through the hills and valleys with careful precision, making their way back to a secluded area near a stream, a place they had previously identified as safe. Exhausted but relieved, they finally allowed themselves a moment to rest. Anita looked at Jacob, a rare smile breaking through his usually serious expression. "We did it, together." Jacob nodded, feeling a deep sense of pride and gratitude. "Yes, together. Trust and patience won today. We survived because we relied on each other." For the first time since their journey began, there was a sense of relief, a quiet moment to reflect on what they had endured. Jacob realized that the trials they faced had not only tested their courage, but had also strengthened the bond between them. Trust, once a fragile and uncertain force, had become the foundation of their survival. Over the next few days, Jacob and Anita continued to move cautiously, avoiding open areas and sticking to hidden trails. The danger had not disappeared entirely, but the immediate threat had passed. They used this time to plan for longer-term safety, mapping routes to more secure areas and identifying places where they could find shelter and resources if needed. During these quiet moments, they spoke more openly about their lives and experiences. Anita shared stories of his family, his homeland, and the challenges he had faced as a young warrior learning to survive in a world that often misunderstood him. Jacob, in turn, spoke of his childhood, his family's ranch, and the lessons of honesty, compassion, and perseverance that had guided him throughout his life. These conversations deepened their understanding of one another, reinforcing the trust that had been built through shared danger and careful observation. One evening, as they sat by a small fire under a canopy of stars, Anita spoke quietly. "I have been hunted for so long," he said. "I forgot what it means to trust someone fully. You have shown me that trust is not weakness but strength. That is something I will carry with me always." Jacob smiled. "And I have learned from you as well. Courage, patience, and the wisdom to see beyond fear. We have both grown through this journey." The following days were spent slowly returning to a safer area near Jacob's ranch, where the immediate danger had lessened. They remained vigilant, but there was a sense of accomplishment and relief. Jacob reflected on the lessons of the past weeks, the importance of trust, the value of partnership, and the strength that could come from compassion in a harsh world. When they finally reached the familiar stretch of land near Jacob's cabin, Anita paused to take in the view. "This place, it is peaceful," he said. "A rare kind of peace." Jacob nodded. "It is, and it is ours to protect, at least for now. You are free to rest here or to continue your journey as you see fit, but know this, you will always have a friend in me." Anita's eyes softened and he offered a small nod. "Thank you, Jacob, for everything. You chose trust when it was difficult, courage when it was risky, and compassion when it mattered most. That is something I will never forget." As they parted ways, each man carried with him the lessons of the journey. Jacob returned to his ranch, forever changed by the experience. He understood that trust, even when it seemed naive, could create bonds stronger than fear. Courage was important, yes, but empathy, patience, and careful judgment were equally vital. Anita continued his journey, moving towards safer lands with a renewed sense of confidence and hope. The memory of Jacob's unwavering support and the partnership they had forged would remain with him, a reminder that even in a world filled with danger and misunderstanding, trust and courage could prevail. In the quiet of his cabin, Jacob reflected on the choice he had made. Some neighbors might call him reckless for helping a hunted man, but he knew the truth. He had acted from his heart, guided by principles that mattered more than fear or judgment. The prairie was still wild, unpredictable, and dangerous, but it was also a place where trust could forge unexpected friendships, where courage could overcome fear, and where compassion could shape a life in ways that nothing else could. The story of Jacob Hayes and Anita spread quietly among the locals, not as a tale of confrontation or heroics, but as a lesson in trust, courage, and humanity. Some called Jacob a hero, others naive, but to those who understood the harsh realities of the prairie, his actions were a testament to the strength of character, the power of trust, and the enduring bond that could exist between two men from very different worlds. As the sun set over the endless prairie, casting long shadows across the golden grass, Jacob mounted Buck for an evening ride. The wind carried the scent of sage and earth, and the world seemed calm, as though acknowledging the quiet victory of courage and trust. Jacob knew that life on the frontier would continue to challenge him, but he also knew that he was not the same man who had first encountered Anita. He had faced danger, tested his judgment, and chosen trust over fear, and in doing so, he had discovered the true meaning of strength and humanity. And so, the cowboy who had trusted a hunted Apache warrior returned to his life, carrying with him the lessons of friendship, loyalty, and courage, forever marked by the journey they had shared, and the bond that had grown stronger than any threat the prairie could offer.